europeanmoments.com, looking into what stories Europe tells, what Europe means, particularly to a younger generation of Europeans, what younger Europeans in particular want the EU to do, and indeed to be. If we go to, this is the homepage here, if we go to the opinion polls page, you will see that we do a series of opinion polls with our partner EU Opinions, a project of the Foundation, and we're delighted to have one of our speakers from EU Opinions. And if we scroll down, Louisa, here are some of the most recent results. Oh yes, go back to the one you just had, if you could. So here we have some of the most recent results, including the extraordinary result that 74% of respondents say the EU would not be worth having without freedom of movement. But if, Louisa, you could show us the one which shows the age groups. Like all opinion polls, we have to make a choice about age groups. And the age group we have chosen is 16 to 29 years old. The idea being that these are the post-89ers. So someone who was born in or just after 1989 would be in that cohort. At one of our other seminars, our colleague Paul Betts, as a historian, said, but look, within these results, within that cohort 16 to 29, you actually have a lot of different historical experiences. What are the historians' generations within that? Is this actually a generation as the 68ers were? And indeed, Louisa, if you can go to the interview page, if you're still there. If you look at the interview page on the website, and I hope this is magically going to appear, we ask Europeans, especially young Europeans, much more subjective questions. What was your formative European moment? What was your best European moment? What was your worst European moment? So it's more like what a historian does, or indeed a journalist does, working with interviews. It's qualitative. And there we get some very interesting differences. So if you just scroll down a little, there you have, and Maeve will talk about this in a moment, all the different moments that people have picked out. So we thought it would be interesting to explore with a demographer, someone who does opinion polling, an historian who's worked on generations, and a member of our own team, how we think about generations, and in particular, what the post-89 generations actually are. And I'm delighted to say that we have exactly that. So to introduce our speakers very briefly, in the order in which they'll speak, Professor Jennifer Dowd, Jen Dowd, is Associate Professor of Demography and Population Health here at Oxford, and also Deputy Director of the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science. She's done a lot of work on social and demographic factors relating to COVID-19. Secondly, we'll hear from Isabell Hoffmann, our hugely valued colleague at EU Opinions, actually the founder of the EU Opinions with Catherine de Vries, the political scientist. Isabell was political editor of Die Zeit, originally did her higher education at Sciences Po, and she's worked very closely with us on this polling, as on all the EU Opinions polling, which I strongly commend to you. Thirdly, our historian, Professor Kostis Kornetis, our dear friend, former visiting fellow at Oxford, now a professor at the Autonomous University of Madrid, who's actually published extremely interesting work on particularly the 68ers in Southern Europe, in Greece, and in Spain, and indeed in Portugal, and is currently working on a book about the generational memories of transitions to democracy in Southern Europe. And last and not least, our team member Maeve Moynihan, our former graduate student here, did a master's in migration studies, now connected with the University of Warwick. And Maeve has done extraordinary work evaluating all those interviews, evaluating, assessing, analyzing those interviews. Each of them will speak in that order for 5 to a maximum of 7 minutes. Then we'll have a little conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll look forward to hearing your questions on the chat, please. So to kick us off, Jen.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to learning from all the panelists. As demographers, we grapple with a lot of data for which generations are very important, but I don't think we reflect as much from a historical point of view. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. So some of you might be wondering what a demographer is exactly, and it is a very difficult discipline to explain to your family and friends. I'd say very crudely, demographers like to count people, you know, how many are born, how many die, and how many migrate. But we're also very interested in links between individual and population level phenomenon. And I think generations are a very good example of this. Individuals obviously make decisions about education, labor markets, migration, marriage, political opinions, but these are very much influenced, you know, and very much a function of population level trends and people who are born at similar times. So in general, demographers don't necessarily delineate specific generations that often. We do think a lot about what we call cohorts, by which we usually mean birth cohorts who are, you know, people born around the same time interval and going through their life cycle together. And demography's concept of the role of cohorts was heavily influenced by a 1965 paper by Norman Ryder on cohorts and social change. And I just really liked this quote, this one particular quote from that paper, where Ryder says, "The members of a cohort are entitled to participate in only one slice of life, their unique location in the stream of history." And I think that's a great jumping off point for this demographic point of view. We're interested in analyzing how changes by cohort can provide a way of understanding how different formative experiences interact with the life course and aging process to influence people's life chances in all sorts of different ways, whether that's health, social, economic outcomes, or social and political views. And so demographers often analyze data by 5 or 10-year birth cohorts rather than these monolithic generations that are popular in some disciplines. And I think that's partly because we recognize that these groups are, you know, overlapping at the population level. We're all connected with several birth cohorts, you know, before us and after us, and so is everyone else. So, you know, making these broader generational groupings, you know, can be informed by a range of factors such as major historical events and demography, pandemics, things like this. But we try to remember that those are very subjective, you know, guidelines for delineating generations rather than hard and fast distinctions. And to some degree, you know, when analyzing data, it really depends what sort of outcome that you're interested in. You know, the categories of cohorts and how you would categorize them might be different if you're thinking about labor market outcomes versus political opinions, for example. So that said, saying that there's not a lot of specific cohort definitions, the baby boom generation is an example of a cohort or a generation that's largely defined by demography. Obviously, its oldest members were part of the spike in fertility that began in 1946, right after the end of World War II, and its youngest members were born in 1964, shortly before kind of a revolution in fertility and the birth control pill and lots of changes there. So while the definition of more recent generations can be a bit subjective, that baby boom really is unique, you know, and delineated by demography itself, which is interesting. So demographers also tend to focus on how cohorts differ in important demographic life events, not surprisingly, like marriage, fertility, education, labor market entry. There's a lot of research on the lasting effects of specific cohorts entering the labor market during economic downturns, for example, and that's going to be really interesting to study going forward with the pandemic. things like marriage have changed a lot over recent cohorts. In 2014, just 28% of millennials were married, compared to 64% of the silent generation when that generation was the same age, between 18 and 33. So these have been, really large changes in demographic behaviors across cohorts. And in my own demographic work, which is primarily on understanding population health and mortality, cohort effects, as we call them, take on really important meaning in trying to disentangle the independent effects of age period and cohort on health. Age, not surprisingly, is a really important risk factor for all health outcomes, but cohort influences end up being really important. Things like cohort smoking patterns are a prime example. They left a huge imprint on mortality patterns across countries, but lagged by 40 years, and also with different timing for men versus women. And so it's very interesting studying mortality, because a lot of people want to attribute recent changes in mortality or life expectancy to very recent things that happened, such as austerity or cuts in the NHS. And some of that, might be true, but with mortality, in some ways, you need to look back in time and see what was happening to these cohorts much earlier in their formative years, when they're, forming health behaviors, but also biological things that might have happened to them, such as the 1918 flu pandemic. So cohorts have biological imprints that go back much farther. And this has come up recently in the US. Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, have been highlighting the huge increase in deaths of despair in the US related to alcohol, opioid overdose, and suicide among middle-aged whites in the US. And they're really hypothesizing that this reflects longer-term trends in economic opportunity and family formation for these affected cohorts much earlier in their lives. So I would say for demographers, studying generations and cohorts, and their impact on later life outcomes or attitudes often requires us to look back in time, like light from a distant star, is how I like to think about it. So I assume this is similar to changes in public opinion and political views, that it's not always recent events, but really cohort or generational changes that are just now emerging. So this is a very difficult analytical challenge, and I look forward to hearing how other disciplines are tackling this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. That was fascinating. Isabell.
Thank you very much, Timothy. As Timothy mentioned, I founded a project on European public opinion. It's called Opinions, and we started in 2015, which makes some data, trending data, interesting enough to look at, but not long enough and not interesting enough to really talk in depth about generations. However, I thought I might as well bring some data and share some data with you about some fundamental trend question that we keep raising and publishing every 3 months. The Opinions is we collect data on European public opinion. We do it EU-wide 4 times a year, which means that we interview in every European member state and every European Union member state's language. We do have a sample from above 10,000. We do in-depth analysis as well as regular published trending data on our website, which you actually can check out yourself. It's opinions.eu, and you can generate graphs yourselves and check out the data on the trending data. These are our quarterly numbers on the fundamentals of political, economic, and personal life in the European Union. We do have 15 trend questions that we actually poll and publish every 3 months. But I will share 5 with you. These 5 concern the classic membership vote, then issues on satisfaction with EU democracy, talking with a friend about the EU, satisfaction with the direction of the European Union, satisfaction with your person, and satisfaction with your personal life, finally. The data is organized by age. We will focus here, I think, on the age groups 14 to 25 and 25 to 35. So I can start with a little spoiler. The younger, the more optimistic. This is basically the main trend you will see. But I would also like to share some general thoughts on the issue of generation zeitgeist or life cycle very quickly, also because Jennifer talked so eloquently about cohorts and how a demographers look at it is. However, I think it's important to note that any measurable long-term change in human behavior can occur for three possible reasons. The one is a trend can be a period effect, which means a change in the zeitgeist. The trend can be an age effect or life cycle effect, which means as people grow old, they change. And the trend can be a generational effect, an effect which we would like to talk about today, which basically means people are born at a certain time and adopt a set of attitudes and keep them over their lifetime. It's very, very difficult to disentangle the three effects. And as I mentioned before, also the depth of our data, the timely depth of our data is not dense enough to make any assumption about this. However, I think it'll be interesting to look at the graphs. So I said the first question would concern the classic membership question. So the question is, imagine there is a referendum and you could decide whether your country stays as a member of the European Union, how would you vote? And I chose to put on display the answers of I would vote for my country to stay in the European Union. And there you can see that we always got very high and affirmative answers with these questions, even in 2015. But the trend has been going up over the last years. And you can see the younger, the more enthusiastic actually people answered that they would vote for their country to stay in the European Union. For the age group 15 to 25, it is even 81% of young people telling us they would vote for their country to stay. In the following age group, so that it would be 25 to 35, it's 74%. It might be interesting to note that the EU all questions are not divided by age is as of right now at 75%. So we have come up quite a significant way of support. However, I have to note that this question always had been a high level, always enjoyed a high level of support within the continental Europe. So when you look now at the question of how satisfied are you with the way democracy works in the European Union, you look at the age difference. I choose to display the numbers of people who answer that they are satisfied with it, and also you can see here slightly less enthusiastic, however, very high level of support, people saying that they're satisfied with the way democracy works in the European Union. For the youngest age group, 14 to 25, it's 70%. 25 to 35, it's 63%. But here you can already see, it's very interesting to go to the first data point, which is right here at 2016. You can see that we had, when you start asking this question, people are very skeptical and hardly satisfied, much more unsatisfied, a large majority being unsatisfied with how democracy works with the European Union. But we have, you can see there is a trend upwards with this question. So when you go at now talk with a friend about the EU, question that I personally like quite a lot, because it allows people to assess basically the atmosphere within their social environment. You can see people are, again, very positive, but they became more positive over the last years. We started with quite a skeptical assessment of how a conversation about the European Union would evolve. But we're back on a point in time where people think that if the European Union came up as a point of conversation, it would be rather a positive conversation than a negative one. So, but now when you look at at the next graph, and this is the graph where we ask about direction of the EU. So when you, the first is the question about vote. The second question was about basically the political system, so democracy and how do you assess the working of democracy in your way. The third one was the question about your social environment and how you believe the conversation would be going on. But this we generally consider as a policy question. So the direction of the EU, so how, you know, the sum of the policies actually work and are assessed by the people, of how they feel that their country, or in this case the European Union, is moving along. And here you see that when we started to ask that question, people were highly negative about the direction the EU is evolving. The trend is going upwards, but it's still the most the question where we get the most skeptical answers. But here also you see that the younger, the more optimistic. So here you have between the age group 14 to 25, 55% of young people say the EU is moving in the right direction, 49. So the first time they actually an age group slides below the 50 bar of people between 25 and 35 say the EU is moving in the right direction. So we see there is a gap between what I like to call questions of principle and potential, what we actually ask when we ask questions of principle and potential of European politics, we get high positive answers. If we ask questions about the state of affairs and short-term assessment or assessment of the short-term future, then basically answers flip and they become much more negative and much more skeptical. And I assume that this is quite normal, that, you know, when you project yourself in the future, say, yes, things could be much better than they actually are. The potential is there, but then look at the reality and it's quite a mess. And, you know, I have to say it doesn't go as well as I believe it could go. But the gap between the positive assessment of the potential and the assessment of the state of affairs for the European Union was way too large for the longest times. The trend go in the right direction, but it's still quite wide. And now as a last point, look at how people think about their personal future. And I find it quite interesting that here for the first time you get a similar data point for people from 14 till 35. It's still a positive assessment, but it's a little bit mellowed down. 66% of people, of the young people look positive in their future. And the older they grow, they're a little bit more pessimist or realist, however you would like to look at it. They look into their personal future. Thank you, Louisa, for making this possible to show the slides.
Thank you very much indeed, Isabel, and a clear message there. The younger, the more optimistic. Question for our discussion: will that be true of the COVID generation, if there is a COVID generation? I know Jen is working on that. In coming to you, Kostis, I just wanted to pick up again what Jen said. The baby boomers clearly, as it were, demographically rather well defined, right? But within them, you have your special subject, the 68ers, who are a quite distinct subcategory of the baby boomers, right? So it's a very interesting example of the difference between, in a sense, the demographer's generation and the historian's generation. Kostis, over to you.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me, Timothy. Such an amazing panel. In my research on student protest in Greece against the colonel's dictatorship, and in Spain against the late Franco regime, I concluded that despite major differences, Southern European movements bore many similarities with a broader political and countercultural dynamism of 68 in the West. We could, in other words, dub them equally the children of Marx and Coca-Cola, to use Jean-Luc Godard's famous term. Now, my methodological approach entailed the collection of oral histories of Southern European 68ers using qualitative interviews. In my work, I tried to go beyond the differentiation of generational belongingness according to either cultural outlook, namely dress, hair, music, style, similar way of expressing oneself, sexual mores on the one hand, and the purely political on the other. All these cleavages between Maoists, Trotskyists, Stalinists, and so on. So I tried to look at them, the cultural and the political, as part and parcel of the same generation. Now, of course, a particular challenge for the historian of the 60s is the proliferation of the term generation, not just in terms of methodology, but also as a massive frame of analysis already in place during the events. So in fact, the 68 movements were at the time dubbed a generational clash, the product of generational conflict, generational gap, and so on. And that poses a burden on the historian who is trying to historicize the events beyond, let's say, the analytical frames and terms of the time. Now, to be more precise, I employed Karl Mannheim's famous idea that a generation is social rather than biological as a phenomenon, and entails a common location in historical time and space, which subsequently creates a predisposition towards a particular mode of thinking, of acting, and of experiencing. Accordingly, generations are not normative periods, but subjectively defined cohorts that exist when they share a historical experience that creates a community of perceptions. So we could codify the 68 generation as a political generation. In Mannheim's view, whenever there is a grave political crisis, a revolution, a civil war, an uprising, those who are closer to adolescence are the ones mostly touched by it. In other words, when someone was an adolescent in 68, he or she was most accessible, open to learning, initiations, etc., that left a lifelong mark on them during these so-called impressionable years than someone saying in their 40s. Now, a typical problem that I encountered goes back to the legendary books by Hervé Hamon and Patrick Rothman, Génération, parts 1 and 2, the first and still widely cited cultural history of the 68 generation in France. Hamon and Rothman have been widely criticized for focusing exclusively on leading figures, on, let's say, success stories of activists, the so-called loudspeakers of their generation. In identifying possible testimonies about the student movements in the authoritarian South, I came across the same problem. The question is, can we really grasp the core of a generation through such voices? Is there a critical mass of people that captures and conveys the ethos of a generation? Some historians maintain that while generational belonging is a consequence of formative experiences, the way in which something was experienced and the way in which something is remembered cannot but be historically contingent and radically plural. And this plurality is particularly true if one adds the crucial variables of class and gender. Again, we're going back to Paul Bett's point that you mentioned, or other variables such as looking beyond the urban centers, for instance, and trying to spot generational experiences in the countryside. They would be radically different. I nevertheless believe that we can approach the lived experience of a group of people that gives the tone to a generation. An idea going back to the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset. This is not to imply that we can create catch-all generational portraits. People belonging to the same political generation, after all, despite common characteristics, are often deeply torn in terms of the basic life choices. I do nevertheless believe that despite a critical distance, we could still use Hamon and Rothman's idea of generational spokespersons. As they argued, in 68, things were experienced collectively to such an extent that not only a shared generational code and habitus was in place, but also the memory of some could stand, well, not fully, of course, for the memory of many, for the ones who sympathized, even for the ones who described themselves as 68ers retrospectively, without even having participated actively in the events. Now, finally, how do we go about analyzing, dissecting this generation? all the aforementioned authors, myself included, try to look at formative experiences before 68. Let's call it the antecedents, networks, schools, for instance, influences like cinema and music in particular, political events that had an impact. That would be Algiers in France, the Auschwitz trials in West Germany, the final stages of the dictatorships in the European South. Yet another tendency by authors such as François Ricard would be to look at early childhood, which could in fact be more critical for generational belongingness. We should, in other words, zoom in the early years of these actors, be it in France or in Greece or you name it, and look at the common traces across the board. These adolescents had been children invariably born right after World War II and during the economic reconstruction and the Cold War. There were the so-called baby boomers, as Jen said, that experienced childhood in a novel way, defined by the proliferation of kindergartens, summer camps, the reading of specific comics, etc. Popular culture, mass media, these are the issues neglected by the original Mannheimian idea that solely focuses on political events as formative experience is a key issue here. These kids with these shared characteristics partook in the urban growth, the expansion of education, the rising youth culture, etc. So in a way, this approach goes, they were already a more or less homogeneous community when 68 arrived. By the late 60s, they felt in charge, ready, confident that they could change history. Well, that's the structuralist approach. And of course, I can discern the danger of some teleological thinking here, but we can always discuss it later on. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostis. That was also fascinating. So the historian puts on the table the notion that generations fundamentally are subjectively defined by shared experience in time and space, and the distinction between actual formative experience and how it is remembered, the generation of a collective memory, which Kostis writes about very interestingly in his book. There's also the interesting question, what are actually the formative years? So Mannheim suggested, roughly speaking, age 17 to 25, which I think for many of us are. I'm certainly speaking for myself. I think those were certainly politically formative years. But Kostis now puts on the table the proposition that if we're looking at other variables, maybe sociocultural ones, maybe the formative years are much earlier. What we're all agreed on so far is the formative experiences are earlier in life, and the effects often seen a long, long time later. With that, over to you, Maeve, for the post-89ers.
Perfect. Thank you all, Isabell, Kostis. Oh, there we go, Jen. Hopefully you can all see these slides. I believe you can. But thank you all for your reflections. So interesting on generations. I will hopefully be able to zip right through our information on our interviewees so that we can dive into some more conversation about kind of those nuanced thought on generations. So I will jump right in here. Just a quick overview of our interview. We've interviewed 108 people since May of 2019, and that number is growing by the day. We would love to have you contribute to our project. I'll touch on that briefly at the end. And of course, this forms our qualitative aspect of the project. So this is by no means a representative sample, but instead is aimed to get at the lived experiences, kind of that slice of life, as Jen was saying, of a variety of different people across Europe, as you can see, from a number of different nations. We're almost balanced in terms of gender, working on that. So again, we've spoken about the nuance of generations. To keep it incredibly simple for the purposes of the presentation, you can get a sense of the percentages of our interviewees and when they were born, before or after 1980. So obviously the majority are since 1980, and we've tried to focus on that post-89er generation. So we began the project with this notion of a formative European moment. So what was the moment at which you felt your European identity or your European relationship to Europe per se? And we expected perhaps that these might be historic moments or moments experienced by again, a generation, however that may be defined. What we found, though, is that the moments, quote unquote, that were most often mentioned were more experiences. So for this post-89er generation, instead of a moment like 1989, which was still cited a number of times, instead it was a moment of personal travel experiences or an Erasmus or a study abroad opportunity, which obviously are communal in a sense that one can have a conversation about a trip or an Erasmus experience, but obviously you are not all experiencing the same thing at the same time. So this sort of theme around mobility started to emerge, and you can continue to see that in our best and worst moments. So the top best moment, as you can see, is Eastern enlargement, and top worst moment, with almost a third of our interviewees listing it, is Brexit. So both of these obviously have certain connotations in terms of that idea of mobility, of movement. Of course, the Eastern enlargement, including a number of people into the area of the Schengen, kind of the movement of people across borders, and Brexit obviously with its own connotations. A couple of our interviewees, one person said, when thinking about Eastern enlargement from Hungary, she said, "Traveling opens your eyes. When I started traveling was when I started to see Europe as a whole." Another one of our interviewees from Spain said, "I still feel at home even if I'm in another European country." So again, this trend of mobility and feeling European rather than, or perhaps in addition to, a regional or a national identity. So we also ask our interviewees, what is the single most important thing the EU has done for you personally? And very interestingly, almost half of the interviewees list the freedom of movement, followed by study opportunities, professional opportunities, which of course often entail movement in themselves. But this freedom of movement is referred to using a number of different words. They might speak of Schengen, open borders, whatever the case may be, but they're all referring to this free movement within the EU. A couple of our interviewees once said that the COVID-19 health pandemic was the best moment. And she said, quote, "Before the health pandemic, I don't think we had realized how much freedom of movement we have." End quote. She's from Romania. So our interviewees have spoken about this movement, and obviously, particularly in relation to the restrictions of movement during the pandemic. So moving on here to our, there you go, to our opinion polling results, which the most recent wave was just published in the last couple of weeks. You can check out that report on all of our website and our social media channels as well. But again, this freedom of movement, I feel like a broken record, emerges as a really prominent theme. So the majority of Europeans pick free movement as one of the top 3 benefits of EU membership, alongside, as you can see, a number of other ideas. And they also, you can see, with Europeans who have a degree, they particularly list this freedom to travel. So perhaps they did make use of Erasmus or a travel experience, and they kind of emerge again as a separate group, which perhaps within a generation or a cohort, there are certain groups who have one experience, whereas others may have a completely different experience, of course. And as Timothy mentioned at the beginning, we have an overwhelming statistic here about freedom of movement. Our opinion poll respondents were presented with a statement: if it did not offer the freedom to travel, work, study, and live in other EU member states, the EU would not be worth having. So 74% of those respondents come from across Europe, again in partnership opinions with which Isabell obviously spoke about. They do not think that the EU would be worth having if it did not include free movement. So again, an interesting generational divide perhaps with people who experienced 1989 versus those who have grown up in a world that is in some ways borderless. So you can see just quickly as well, Timothy mentioned that age breakdown. Interestingly, across age, free movement is listed as a priority. Most of the differences here fall within the margin of error. So it's very interesting to see, again, across generations, that this is still emerging as a particularly salient theme. So finally, returning to the last question that we ask our interviewees, So turning away from that polling and back to our sample of 138, we asked them, what would you most like the EU to accomplish by 2030? And about a third list climate policy. So as we've talked about, different generations, perhaps Generation E defined by Erasmus. People have spoken about Generation C with regard to COVID, but perhaps could also reference Generation C with climate. Climate has emerged particularly for very young Europeans, Gen Z as they're often called, again, followed by other ideas of unity and cohesion, as well as expansion and integration. So I think you can take this theme of movement. One of our interviewees said, quote, Schengen, the fact that you can travel around Europe without borders, just the fact that it fosters exchanges. I think Schengen is one of the biggest achievements of the European Union, especially for our generation. That interviewee was from France. So as we move into this conversation with our wonderful panelists, we can sort of think about perhaps this idea of mobility and how our different generations have responded to the gift of mobility or lack thereof. And as I mentioned, of course, we would love to have you contribute. You can submit your own video, tell us your thoughts on our website, which we can give you all the information, europeanmoments.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Maeve. That was great. By the way, Louisa, if we put in the chat the link to the page where you can do a self-interview. Now we're starting to get some interesting comments. I'm just going to take a couple which ask the same rather obvious question, which is, why do you have interviewees from the USA but nowhere else outside Europe? I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, Maeve, the main answer to that is they're Americans who normally have a dual nationality or are based in Europe. Is that right?
Correct. It would be the nation that they most identify with, but they might have an EU passport.
Yeah, so quite a few. For example, someone mentioned on the chat Tony Jutt. Well, Daniel Jutt's son was actually our student, and of course, being Daniel Jutt's son, he has a British passport as well as an American one. So that's the answer to that. But the basic idea of the sample is it is Europeans, not just EU citizens, but Europeans talking about Europe from inside. So that's the answer to that question, which several people asked. There was another question on the freedom of movement. Maeve, significant difference in your qualitative data by social class or education, do you think?
I don't think so particularly. I couldn't reference specifics, of course, but it's often referenced whether the movement was used for study or simply for a trip across a border, whether a parent worked over the border, etc. So I can't say for sure, but not necessarily.
Thanks very much. I mean, that's, of course, we know perfectly well, as Maeve said, this is not in any way a representative sample. There's massive selection bias, younger, better educated, and so on. But we can ask the question of our polling data. I don't know if Dan or Ailey would like to come in on this, but I suspect there was a small education effect, higher education correlating with stronger enthusiasm for freedom of movement, but relatively small. But Dan and Ailey, if you're on the chat, do come in there and we might even let you in to speak. We were asked if there's a difference between West Europeans and East Europeans on the enthusiasm for freedom of movement. Somewhat less, interestingly enough, in Poland, which in a way you might think is surprising, since 5% of the Polish population has moved outside the country, many of them to Britain and Ireland. But maybe it's a reflection of a concern about the impact of freedom of movement on the country of origin, which is significant. Now, I just want to go to the panel for a moment to explore this idea. If anyone would like to jump in on anything anyone else has said, but particularly, when are the formative experiences? Maybe we have to control for what variable you're looking for. In other words, maybe if you're looking for political experiences, Mannheim is right, maybe it's 17 to 25. But if you're looking for smoking, Jen, you mentioned, maybe it's earlier. If you're looking for deeper psychological things, it may be even earlier. Would anyone like to jump in on that from the panel? Jen, would you like to comment on that?
I think that's right. I know a lot of this was focused on political views in this, I think the 17 to 25, or maybe that's expanding more now since a lot of young people are delaying family formation and, staying, maybe even living with their families longer. I think it'd be interesting to know if that period has been expanded more recently, but certainly for a lot of health outcomes, we focus on very early life, even prenatal exposures for influencing health outcomes, educational, influences as well. And that had me thinking a lot about COVID and, for what, slice of the age distribution is this going to be the most impactful? And I think there's going to be so much interesting research in that regard, because young adults obviously have been so impacted by, the unemployment, but also the social isolation aspect of this and delaying, dating and marriage and all sorts of knock-on effects from that. So I think COVID's going to be one of those huge events that has very different impacts across cohorts, and to see how that plays out over the long run will be interesting. The 1918 flu pandemic is still being studied for demographers for a lot of health reasons. If you were in the womb prenatally in 1918, it impacted your future wages and cognitive ability and all sorts of things. So, these are things that, have lagged effects that I think will play out for quite some time.
That's a fascinating comment that the 1918 flu pandemic is still being studied. Could you say just a quick word about how you studied that, if you were trying to test for that effect?
For an effect,
a COVID cohort effect.
A COVID cohort effect. Yeah, so we're actually hoping, so, I don't know if you know, the UK is doing a very large weekly infection study where they test people within households. So they are getting children and older people weekly to see if they're positive. And so we're hoping to continue that as a longitudinal study where we can, follow up family members, so of all different ages, hopefully for many, many years. I'm hoping this is a decades-long endeavor to look at, and very specifically, we'll have people who were negative, people who tested positive, but from a representative sample of the entire country, and hopefully then track, all sorts of things, their social and educational outcomes. And so that will let us look very directly at the impacts of being infected with COVID. But there's, ironically, the UK has a lot of studies, longitudinal studies that are called cohort studies, the 1946 birth cohort, there's a 1958, and so on, that, have collected data on people for decades, and also are really looking at the impact and doing special data collection on COVID for all these social and economic outcomes. So I think that will be it'll be kind of the golden age of demography, even after I think epidemiology and immunology are having their moment, but demography and the social sciences more broadly will have a lot to do to follow this up in the longer run.
Thank you very much. We'll have the demographers on the Today program instead of the epidemiologists. Kostis, did you want to come in on this question of formative experiences? Because you've obviously thought about it a lot. Whether one should control for different variables.
I think we should look at different variables, at least in terms of historians who are very critical of the term generation in the past few years, and especially when it comes to 68. I think that's one of the reasons put forward was precisely the fact that it is very misleading if we just look at one particular variable, or if we only focus on the political, or if we only focus on the cultural. So there is this quest for an all-encompassing view. Well, of course, that becomes much more complex and much more difficult, but probably the picture is going to be richer in the end. So I agree with that. I'm against the idea of looking at solely political stimuli or solely socio-cultural stimuli, because thinking about the 68 generation, I don't think it's it's even true. I think they were really interlinked. They were, you know, they really went hand in hand, the sociocultural and the political, very often. The one informed the other. So, you know, I'm in favor of having both. Just a little asterisk, unrelated, but when Maeve was thinking about the new terms and new generations, like Generation C, I just wanted to put forward also this term, which I found very amusing, of the baby Zoomers. So I think it's, you know, it plays with the baby boomers. And, you know, we're dealing now with a generation of kids, well, including my son, pretty much born during this time of the pandemic. And, you know, very much, their lives are already very much defined by it. So, you know, we're Zooming all the time. So I just wanted to add this because I find it, you know, very interesting.
What wonderful, Kostis. Unlike us baby boomers, they'll never speak well on mute. They'll know immediately to their mic, right? So let me just pick up a couple of things from the thread and then go to Isabell. So Dan, who was in our polling data, responded to the question about difference by education level on freedom of movement. And what he says is it's a very small difference. So they're actually surprisingly little. So while many people think of it as, you know, so much a generational thing, there's massive enthusiasm for freedom of movement. And Paul Betts, who started us on this journey, asked the question about the other formative moments. If you go to the chat, Maeve has brilliantly put all the other formative moments in there, and they're all on the page of the website by popularity. Isabell, there was a question which I think is effectively to you, which was to ask whether the same issue about controlling by education or class when it comes to positivity towards the EU. Are there significant differences by social class or educational level?
There are slight differences, but not huge differences that we see. Also, when you go into, hasn't been mentioned, but the gender, you know, if you check for gender, you also see that there is hardly any difference. I mean, it really depends on, obviously, on the question and on the focus. But when it comes, the effect is not as large as you could suspect. What we actually do see, and I would like to, because it's a general observation I make in the data, it's just an observation I kind of propose to you. I do not connect it with any sort of meaning, because I don't know what to make of it, and we have not really made an in-depth study on that. But there seems to be some turning point around the age of 35. So when you kind of try to recall the graphs I showed, the slides I showed, you do see that there is a difference between, well, there seems to be that a certain level of adaptation is reached by the age of 35, and then the differences in attitude and opinions do not vary or differ as much as they do with the younger cohorts. So there it is.
So basically, we've worked it all out by 35, or we're too stubborn to change our minds after.
Well, now we obviously could start playing around with the idea that there is, as I put it before, as kind of as people grow older, they change, and there seems to be a certain maybe a level of adulthood, or being entirely kind of in your adult life and in your work life, et cetera, have reached, and then enter your family life, that you maybe settle on a certain level of issues. But as I said, we have not made an in-depth study about it, but it is something that we observe time and again through all variation of questions when we check for age in the data.
I think that's very interesting comment, Isabel. I mean, just on, I think political formative moments do come somewhere in there, 16, 17 through to mid-late 20s. So one generation there clearly are the true 89ers. The true 89ers, not someone like me who experienced 89 intensely, but was already in my mid-30s. The true 89ers are the generation of Anne Applebaum, Ivan Krastev, Timothy Snyder, Jan Werner Müller, to name a few well-known names, all of whom were roughly in that 17 to 25 age span in 89. And for them, it was absolutely the formative experience, as 68 was for the true 68ers, right? But you need a very big political experience to have that effect. And it's striking that our second most popular formative moment was the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was 1989. This takes me to a question about the post-89ers, which I'd love any of you to pick up. It comes from Mark Robinson. Great panel, thank you. Could Generation Z, those between the mid-1990s and early 2000, born between mid-1990s and early 2000, be the last generation in the sense that the clear distinctions between cohorts prior to that are less clear with each cohort that follows, the blurring of delineation lines being due to ever-increasing trans-cohort sharing of online experiences than was possible in the past. Also, the values of Generation Z seem well shared by those that follow. He signs it off, Mark in Lund, free to move within Sweden only for the moment. Very interesting question. So were they in a way the last generation? Would anyone like to have a go at that? Jen?
I guess I'll just, it's a very interesting question, I guess, the degree to which social media has changed. And I thought there was a Generation I for a while after the, born since the iPhone, that was a delineation for the change in that technology. But it's an empirical question. I don't know the answer. I'm interested in the hypothesis that it blurs the lines of the generations, because in some ways, I feel like some of the technology is so niche, that only certain age groups or cohorts use TikTok versus Facebook. And so it's a really interesting proposition, but I hadn't thought of it as blending the cohorts as much as you suggested. But I'd be interested in what others think.
Anyone else? Maeve, Isabel, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see in our interviewees, at least, that there is a certain degree of blurring. And I wouldn't say we have a whole lot of representatives from Gen Z, hoping to kind of increase that perhaps in the coming months. But there is a lot of overlap regardless of specific age. So someone, for example, a couple of weeks ago wasn't alive during 1989, but she listed 1989 as her formative European moment because she knew that that was formative for Europe, and so it was formative for her. She was speaking about her parents. So I think it is interesting, from obviously know very little about demography, but interesting to kind of see how perhaps things do sort of blur, and particularly now, I think all of us feel like life is a blur. So how the generation of this moment will be able to even kind of make a distinction between years, or kind of that slice of life again, Jen, that you had mentioned.
It's a very interesting point you just made, Maeve, which is, of course, we shouldn't, if you look at the historiography, the formative moment isn't necessarily a moment in your own life. It could be a moment in the life of your nation or your continent. It could be the Second World War, for example, or the Warsaw Rising. Kostis, did you want to come in on this?
Yes, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like an interesting proposition. I'm a little bit skeptical. I don't think that the lines are so blurred that we don't see generational belongingness anymore. You know, I see a lot of common characteristics, you know, along the millennials, for example, which is a very heterogeneous bunch of people, and you know, we could call it like a global generation if you like. But still, you know, I can see certain affinities going on there. So technology, that's one thing. But again, the way in which technology is used and the way in which technology is experienced, again, varies from generation to generation. Again, in the 1960s, there was a similar discussion going on about the new technologies and about all the amazing breakthroughs that made Marshall McLuhan talk of the global village and so on. And still, you had very distinct generations in place. One thing that I wanted to bring into the discussion, however, is also the issue of how a generation posits itself vis-a-vis other generations, which at least in the 60s, but also I guess regarding the 89ers, was a big thing. And I think this creates also the feeling of identification and community. So us against someone, or us trying to finish the job of a previous generation, right? It doesn't have to be oppositional. So that's something to have in mind. And connected to that, if you like, closely connected to that, is also the idea of the intergenerational transmission. So what kind of impact does intergenerational transmission have? Let's say, again, for the 68ers that I have in my mind, did their parents talk to them about, how did they talk to them about the 30s or the 40s, about fascism, right? That's a very important thing. Again, for the 89ers, it's the same thing. What did they know about 68 in Prague or Warsaw, or you name it? So I think that it's really important. And in my current book, I'm also interested to see how 68ers, in turn, talked to their kids about things. So again, generational transmission is interesting because it brings together, it shows how different generations are connected, and I think it's important to think about this parameter as well.
Fascinating. I've got quite a few questions, including actually a couple for you, Isabell. Daniel Hardy asks, is there evidence of views becoming more similar across countries? I.e., do young Europeans by country hold more similar views than do older Europeans? I think that's particularly to Isabell, to some extent perhaps to Maeve. Stefan Schwed says, thank you, fascinating topic and its handling by the speakers. He talks about the differences between 68 in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, which you, Kostis, will be familiar with. Namely, in Paris, they wanted socialism, and in Warsaw, they wanted to get rid of socialism. But of course, the socio-cultural attitudinal shifts were much more similar, but played out over a longer timescale. So Danny Cohn-Bendit on the 40th anniversary of 68 said, we succeeded socially and culturally, and thank heaven we failed politically, which I think is a brilliant summary. So you're looking at those long-term effects, particularly social and cultural ones. But Stefan also asks, and this is to Maeve and Isabell, I think particularly, but maybe also to Jen, haven't some post-89 junctions been equally significant and divisive? He mentions Iraq War, NATO-EU enlargement. I would add Eurozone crisis for Southern Europe, the Greater Generation, and then, of course, we come to the great unknown, COVID, whether COVID is actually a milestone marking the end of this slightly ill-defined post-1989 generation, which I think is right, and maybe a new, very well-defined generation? That's a question to all of you. To Isabell from our team member, Christian Fidanovsky, how do people's political views change as they get older? Do they become more economically conservative because they don't want to pay taxes on their growing earnings, he says optimistically, or socially conservative because they've developed a more cynical outlook on life? Thank you, Christian. That's what you think of us old people. Mean and cynical. Let me add something into that mix. We've had mentioned cohort effects, period effects, age life cycle effects, and generational effects. When we put together the disciplines, we get all these different disciplinary terms. Are we absolutely sure we're clear about the conceptual vocabulary? I'm not sure myself I'm absolutely clear about the difference between those four kinds of effects. So if anyone would like to tackle that. And then finally, is there any evidence, and this is a question from me, that we might be coming towards the end of what has been called Generation E, the Europe generation, the generation born basically into a Europe fairly whole and free, embracing that Europe whole and free, loving freedom of movement, within which there's a smaller self-identified cohort, to Kostis's point, which is of course the Erasmus generation, right? So that's a clear example of subjective self-identification, where the Erasmus generation. But is there any evidence that that is coming towards its end, and that maybe a different set of attitudes is coming up in very young Europeans, perhaps more nationalistic or more conservative? So let's take those, obviously pick and choose in reverse order, if I may, starting with Maeve, if you'd like to pick up on any of those.
I'll do so quickly so that we can all hear from the rest of the panelists. I think in response to the last question, I'll point again to our EU opinions results, particularly on authoritarian regimes and climate change in our last poll, I believe published in December. I can't remember the statistic, young Europeans.
53%.
Thank you. So 53% of young Europeans felt that authoritarian regimes were better equipped to deal with the climate crisis, which, at least from my perspective, quite concerning. So I think it is interesting to see, and again, as we speak about COVID over and over again, how kind of when we do emerge, hopefully from this blur, how will this have impacted feelings like that? If the EU does indeed fail to some extent with this vaccine rollout, will that increase EU skepticism among young Europeans, and will they feel indeed that certain forms of government, such as authoritarian regimes, are better equipped to deal with things? So I think there's definitely an argument to be made there.
Thank you very much, Maeve. It's a fascinating point. So it was 53% said they thought authoritarian regimes were better equipped to tackle the climate crisis than democracies. Kostis.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll pick Stefan's question, which is a great one, and it's absolutely true that there are big differences between the cases. Around 68, I belong to a group of historians who worked a lot on transnational links, and we tried to talk a lot about the similarities, but that really doesn't mean that there were no fundamental differences. I remember Milos Forman, the Czech film director, the famous film director, who was in Paris during May 68, and he was really surprised by all the red flags that he was seeing around him. So that's of course a big difference. But there is a loose identification, maybe an instinctive identification, which I find interesting. Anna von der Goltz made some, a German historian, great points on that on both sides of the Iron Curtain, there was a certain porosity of that Iron Curtain, and you have a counterculture with different characteristics, but still a counterculture, evolving in both. On both there is an emphasis on politics, political theory. On both sides there was a belief in the power of political activism to alter the future. Actually, the power of that generation to alter the future here and now. I think this, this is a common thing, and the political romanticism as well. Maybe irrational. It was dubbed, I think, irrational by critics. Utopian, you name it. That was also a common theme. But apart from that, of course, major differences. And I find the idea of the generations plural as a very fruitful one.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kostis. I think just on that point, there was a question about where Fridays for Future fits into this picture we're drawing. Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, the Greater Generation. And if we're talking about, a belief that politics can change things, perhaps some political romanticism, one might want to look at that particular generation, which is, of course, slightly younger than the classic Erasmus generation. Isabell.
About actually how people's attitude change, I think they mellow down. It's not that young people have, from the data we see, totally different attitudes, at least when it comes to the fundamentals, than their older peers. But they, as you could see in the graphs, they seem to be more optimistic. And by good measure. So if you and then basically I think I would describe it as mellowing down. I wouldn't go as far as saying that they become immediately more conservative. Maybe that's a question of taste, how you would like to describe it. But there seems to be maybe a cooling off effect or a mellowing down effect. Because you brought it up, Timothy, the concept I tried to between period effect, life cycle effect, and generational effect, I had like a very quick description of it. So the life cycle effect was people change as they grow old. The generational effect, obviously, people born at a certain time adopt a set of attitudes, or common attitudes, so the cohort basically adopts a set of common attitudes and keeps them over their lifetime. So they might change a little bit as they grow old, but they keep like the basic set of attitudes. And then the period effects, that would be basically the broad effect, is a change in the zeitgeist, where you see that, basically maybe the life cycle effects and the generational effects combined have an impact on the zeitgeist and lifts it up or changes it. And then the question about age and country and differences. Well, when obviously it's a very interesting, very profound one. As I said before, you cannot disentangle the attitudes of young people with the attitudes of their older peers. So obviously young people are also influenced by the political culture, by the public discourse that's around them, etc., etc. So obviously there where we see a constant differences in attitudes when it comes also to the differences between member states. You see the generational effects, but they are parallel to, I'd say, the national effects, right? Which does not mean that there is a certain consistency when it comes to the effects of our European sample. And I would like to point out that this maybe also is the very original and maybe even innovative approach that we take here, is that we actually have a pure EU-wide sample. It is not a combination of different national samples, but a real European sample. We do have national samples, but they are separated. So our European sample is not an accumulation of different national samples, but a true European sample. And there I would say, obviously, when you also look at regional differences, the impact of these very important life-changing, impressionable kind of mega events like the fall of the Berlin Wall would obviously mean very different things to somebody who grew up in the western part as I did, or friends of mine who actually grew up in the eastern parts of Germany, of Europe, etc., etc. So I remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was quite young, but I do remember it. Obviously, my family had absolutely no connection to Eastern Germany or Eastern parts. So there was actually the lack of personal direct implication of what this meant. I know from friends how deeply rooted and how important also the family experiences and the impact, etc., on their life was. Hence, I think you would see a lot of differences when you check for generational divide and country differences here. Also, you already mentioned it, and here I have to recur to also the study that my co-author and co-founder Catherine de Vries put out on the impact of the Euro crisis on attitudes of young people towards the European Union.
Thank you very much, Isabell. I have a comment in here, which I'm just going to throw in at this stage from Kenneth Ibbett. Hi, Kenneth. Of course, in the future, the impact of immigration and cultural diversity will make the whole idea of a homogeneous A group suspect, which is an interesting thought. Jen, in coming to you, can I just ask again this question of where cohort effects fit into the typology of cohort effect that Isabell has laid out?
Yes, I wanted to pick up on that. I would say in the typology that you laid out with 4 things, in demography at least, we would consider cohort effects the same as the generational effects. And there's a whole class of data analytic models called APC methods, age period cohort. So it's a very tricky thing to analyze with data. And in Isabell's figures, I think it was great. You could see that those lines by age tended to move in the same direction over time, so that we would interpret as a period effect, that there was something in the zeitgeist for everyone that was, raising opinion for a certain period of time. But what's difficult to disentangle are those age and cohort effects. So, because from what you showed us, we could interpret those as age effects, but it could also be the year people were born that's influencing their opinion. And we really can't disentangle that unless we had questioned previous, older cohorts at exactly the same age and exactly the same questions. And of course, for political opinion, that's very difficult because the relevant questions change over time. So with health, we can do it and we can disentangle a little better. If we're looking at trends in obesity or smoking, we can see what was happening with different cohorts at the same age in the past and disentangle those. But it seems to me with these types of unique political movements, it's a bit trickier to tease that apart.
Would you like to pick up any of the other questions that were raised, including the COVID generation question?
The COVID generation, yeah, I as I said, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what age group or cohort does have the biggest imprint, whether it is the young adults, or we know that young mothers have left the labor force in droves because of all the challenges of homeschooling and everything. So I think there's a couple different places in the life course for which we're going to have to look for these lasting imprints on future outcomes. And certainly the young kids, I guess they will be the baby Zoomers, but I imagine them being more adaptable, and that it, in the long run, as long as, everyone in their family was healthy, that they might do okay and have more flexible ability to adapt all this technology in the long run.
But I was interested when you mentioned the APC models, because, and the fact that you weren't, as it were, able to go back and interview people in 1918, which is admittedly a difficulty. But of course you could now. So it seems to me, and this is in a way something I wanted to say in pulling together the threads of this fascinating discussion, that maybe now already one should be thinking about what an interdisciplinary study of APC effects COVID generation, quote unquote, would be, so that one could start collecting the evidence the way a demographer does, the way an opinion pollster does, the way a qualitative interviewer does, the way a historian does already at this point.
That's a great idea. I would love to embark on that together in a big, I think it will be the big ask for social science for the next few decades.
Yeah, yeah. That is certainly my, I mean, nobody knows, but I certainly think it must be true that such an enormous transnational event, there's nothing between 1989 and 2020 which affects all Europeans in similar ways and beyond, must leave a deep imprint. But what exactly that imprint will be, it's obviously quite difficult to say. And whether it will turn out to be very differential in terms of class, geography, and so forth, that too. Anyway, on that note, thank you all very much. There have been many appreciative comments in the chat. Thank you all of those who've attended and made comments. In the chat, you can find the links. We'd love you to come online and give us your interviews. Louisa, maybe if you post just one more time in the chat, the link for that. And meanwhile, thank you very much indeed to our panelists, Jen, Isabell, Kostis, Maeve. It was a terrific discussion, really fascinating. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.